Hello and welcome to the Gulf International Forum and our panel today, Gulf-Israel Relations between Government Normalization and Public Opinion. Today we welcome friends and colleagues across more than a dozen time zones to participate in a discussion on one of the most surprising events of the last several decades, the announcement of normalization, a term not usually heard in the diplomatic dialogue, about the longest-running, seemingly most intractable dispute that has plagued the Middle East for the full lifetime of most of us here today. A few of us are old enough to remember when it started, but there's not very many of us anymore. In the last month, two Arab countries, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, announced a decision to normalize relations with the State of Israel, breaking with what we had believed to be a taboo. Namely that no Arab state, except of course Egypt and Jordan, which have already made peace treaties with Israel, would make peace until the Israelis had made peace with the Palestinians. The Arab League in 2002 enshrined this position by adopting the initiative proposed by Saudi Arabia and reconfirmed it in 2007 and 2017. Yet, unexpectedly, two Gulf Cooperation Council countries, almost 1,000 miles away from the dispute, that had never actually participated in any war against Israel, agreed to sign peace treaties with the Jewish state. We've been swamped with analyses, stories, and speculation about how and why they took this initiative. Today, we do not plan to cover the same ground. Rather, we've asked four well-informed personalities with experience and ties to the protagonist to discuss where this precedent-shattering event will lead. Will other Arab states, in particular other GCC states, follow the UAE and Bahrain? What do we know about the views of the citizens of those states regarding this decision? Does it strengthen or weaken their domestic solidarity? The decision has been described as the foundation of a formal alliance against Iran. Is it really? Does it make a difference? Can we ask the same question about Israeli citizens? How do those who believe a two-state solution is in Israel's interest view this agreement in contrast to those who advocate the extension of Israeli sovereignty across the entire historic land of Israel? Finally, the third element, the United States of America. We are about to hold a presidential election that for the first time will decide which almost diametrically opposed vision of the future of the United States will prevail. In short, where goeth the United States? Our panelists bring enormous resources to this discussion today. I will not go into dreadful details. You can find their biographies in the invitation page to this event. However, kicking off the discussion, Aaron David Miller, currently a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, I've been corrected, for International Peace, but more importantly, a close personal friend and colleague with whom I had innumerable opportunities to work and interact in the course of my own career. Aaron himself can be termed a protagonist in the search for peace in the region. For most of you who had an opportunity to see the Washington Post this morning, I recommend Aaron's article entitled Arab-Israeli Progress Seemed Impossible. That's because of old assumptions. I call your attention to the subtitle, Peace Process Veterans Thought Step One was Solving the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. Maybe we were wrong. To bring us the view from the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, Dr. Mohamed Ghanem Alrumaihi, a distinguished academic from Kuwait, having served on more boards, panels, and advisory committees than I have the time to name, a professor of university and the editor-in-chief of the Kuwaiti daily newspaper, Awan. The discussion so far has centered mostly on the Arab side of the equation, sharing her thoughts and observations on how the Israelis, government and public, see this unexpected turn of events. Dr. Shira Efron, from the most authoritative Israeli think tank, the Institute for National Security Studies. Dr. Efron, Shira, works in the U.S. as well with the RAND Corporation and is an adjunct scholar at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And lest we forget that the element that sees itself as the ultimate stakeholder in this discussion, Khalid Saffuri, another good friend and longtime colleague and the founding president of the National Interest Foundation, will bring us his analysis on how Palestinians see their way forward. Each will present for a housekeeping now. Each will present for a maximum of 5 or 6 minutes before we turn to the discussion. Please have your questions on the chat as early as possible. As always, we never get to all of them, and I will take the liberty of taking several questions on the same or similar subject and summarize them for the panelists. Anyway, to start off, my friend Aaron, please.
Patrick, thanks. And it's an honor to be here with Mohamed, Khalid, and Shira, and with you too, longtime colleague and friend. I think I'll save where we go from here, where we may be going, since divining the future. Well, we have to approach divining the future with great humility these days. I want to spend a few minutes talking about the American rule as best I understand it, and then close with a comment or two on why we seemed, or I won't say we, why many of us, especially me, missed this particular development. It was clear to me during several of my initial meetings with Jared Kushner in 2017, 2018, that they had a very specific agenda in mind. Yes, the Palestinian issue, the problem of the much too promised land, was to be centrally featured in their ultimate vision for peace plan. But during my discussions with him, it became unmistakably clear that the real game, and on reflection, I think it's been borne out by empirical evidence, the real game was not the two-state solution in a sense that I think it could become a real viable enterprise. It was more along the lines of the 22-state solution. Not that the Trump administration believed that they would get all 22 members of the Arab League to enter into some sort of normalization process with Israel, but Mr. Kushner made it clear, unmistakably clear, willfully clear, that his objective was to cultivate what he termed strategic relations with Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. And the objective of these strategic relationships, in addition to what I call the off-the-table benefits, jobs, arms sales, and political influence, was to enlist the Arabs to A, create a set of incentives for the Israelis to move on this, and B, if they could, create a series of disincentives for the Palestinians. The logic was Palestinians, you'll get 50 cents on the dollar if you agree to what we're proposing this week. It will go down to a quarter if you don't agree next week. And ultimately, you may well, because the Arabs may well decide to move without you, get zero. And over the next several years, Mr. Kushner made good on his strategy. Instead of cultivating strategic relations with Palestinian interlocutors, not that that's ever an easy quest, he decided to identify both Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed as key centrally located players in this. And the two of them, recognizing the change that had occurred between Obama and Trump and the pro-Israeli sensibilities and anti-Iranian sensitivities of the administration and their autocrat-friendly sensibilities, were only too willing and happy to comply. And in this autocrat-friendly environment, the Trump administration gave both of them, MBS and MBZ, an enormous amount of latitude in Yemen with respect to Qatar, certainly on arms sales, invoking emergency authorization to Saudi Arabia. And have we seen, whether it was a cover-up or acquiescence or get-out-of-jail-free card for MBS, enormous latitude to pursue his repressive policies both at home and ultimately led to the tragic murder and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi, a friend of many of us, including mine. So it seemed to me, although I never anticipated that the investment would pay off to desire to gain ground and influence in Washington to please Mr. Trump, arms sales, all of these has created a foundation on which the Trump administration invested extremely heavily. And they did so again with both MBZ and MBS. And I think I had a piece in Politico in May in which was titled, "Are the Arabs Trying to Make Peace with Israel Without the Palestinians?" But I never believed that any Arab state would actually pursue normalization of relations with Israel. Paradoxically, it may well be that the Emiratis and the Bahrainis, in a matter of months or years, will move much more in line and closer to the Israelis than the Egyptians and Jordanians have done in decades. And obviously, there are reasons for that. Finally, let me conclude. Whether or not the people-to-people prospects of this normalization come to pass or not is not the point. My takeaway from this exercise, geopolitically, is that what it represents is the shattering of what remained of the Arab consensus, both with respect to Israel and toward the Palestinians. And I think it is likely, whether or not Mr. Trump wins or Mr. Biden wins, that there will be other Arab states that will pursue normalization, even while they adhere seriously, half seriously, or not at all, to the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative. They will all untether themselves to the degree that they think is politically wise and possible to cut their own separate arrangements with the Israelis, and building on a premise that Sadat validated, that the road to Washington for off-the-table benefits, political influence, weapons, and a commitment to support their regional goals lies through Jerusalem.
Aaron, that covered the countryside really well. I have some questions later, but let's proceed. Dr. Mohamed, please, the view from the Gulf.
Well, we all know the history of this conflict. It's deep, it's unfortunate, and I think we have paid a lot in this conflict. I'll start by saying that the Emirates and the Bahrainis have bought an insurance certificate, if you like, insurance policy for their own goals, i.e., we all in the region, even in Saudi Arabia and some other places, we think that now and today, for the last 40 years, we find that the Iranian have this idea of hegemony over this area. And if it is good for them, for Islamic Republic, it is not good for us. So we look around and we have seen the intervention of the Iranian in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and all have ended with chaos and street fighting. That's why some of decision maker in this area have looked to the other way to have some sort of balance. Now, of course, the Iranian is very furious now, and they were taken by surprise, I believe. To go to the normalization, what's going on really is the normalization between Egypt, Jordan, Palestinians, now Emirates and Bahrain. But the non-official normalization is there. I'm sure you know the countries which the Israelis have some sort of representative as well. To my mind, some other countries will be coming in few months, mostly probably 1 year. In this area, we have unfortunately devastated by two things, historically speaking. One, the discovery of oil, which make other power come to the area in different ways. The second is the creation of Israel. The creation of Israel, in fact, have sounded all over the Arab world, and the coup d'etat starting from Egypt, Syria, Sudan, Libya, whatever it is, most of them, they jump to power and their first commitment to a free Palestine. This is have not happened despite all the blood shed which we have seen. So the other alternative is to change the public opinion. I think that what we have now, an opportunity to change the public opinion. It's hard to do that because for the last 70 years, we all we have been taught at the university, at the media, everywhere else, that those are the enemies. Now, how can you change the public opinion that they are not the enemies? We have two things. I think public opinion in the Arab world and the public opinion in Israel. We remember that when we talk about normalization, we always forget the normalization between the Palestinians themselves and the Israelis. What has happened in the 90s, that they came very close when I think Mr. Pires was in power. Until he was, Mr. Rabin was in power, until he was assassinated. So the plan was getting shambled at that day. But during that time, there was a very good force within the Israelis feeding the public that we are surrounded by enemies. Now we can say to the Israelis, it is not anymore enemies, at least a good number of them. The public opinion here in the Kuwait, small elements of the elite, if you like, look to the step as a good opportunity. There are two other elements. The Islamist groups, the political Islam is against that. The political Islam from two sides. One, the Sunnis, and the other are the Shias. If you look to the banners now in Tehran and in Sana'a, you will find that death to America and death to Israel. The Iranians have jumped on this sentiment to, in fact, take advantages of the Lebanese, Syrians, and other countries with no real objective for modernity and peace. Having said that, I think most of our countries which have been normalizing with Israel, the public opinion will go with the government, generally speaking, even in Saudi Arabia, even in Oman. And we remember that Mr. Netanyahu was in Muscat just a few months ago, and he met with late Qaboos in Muscat. A good number of delegates, if you like, has come to this area in different shape and under different names. To conclude, I think it is a good idea, but the easy things has been behind us. The more difficult things is in front of us. How can we convince, first of all, the Israeli public that they can live in peace with this area, and how can we convince the Arab having the fight within some Arab countries that we can live with the Israelis. I remember,
Dr. Mohamed, if I could interrupt at this point, you've raised some really very interesting questions. And we can take them on. I would like to ask Shira, if perhaps you could even begin with your first question is, how do you convince the Israelis that there are Arabs who make peace? Shira?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Well, thank you for having me here. I appreciate being on this panel with my fellow panelists. And I apologize for my voice. I have a little bit of a cold, not COVID. I checked. So the Israeli public does not think about peace, and it's not just because of COVID. It is not concerned with primarily the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I'm separating them because there's really no Israeli-Arab conflict. There's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's the legal term is, there's occupation of the Palestinian population, and this is the immediate conflict with the other countries. We can talk about Lebanon and disputes, but it's really with the Palestinians. I'll just give you an anecdote. If you all recall, a couple of months ago, Aaron and I spoke about this also. Israel was about to annex territory in the West Bank. Arguably, the UAE markets their normalization agreement with Israel as preventing the annexation. There were polls in Israel that asked Israelis what they think about it. What are the main issues that they're thinking about? To remind you, the King of Jordan threatened to sever ties with Israel. The Europeans threatens to undercut funding. Democrats in the U.S., 4% of Israelis said it's a big issue in their mind. The problem is, and this is something that I think if we could talk about, in the discussion, how do you create incentive for the Israelis to make the concessions for peace with the Palestinians? I'm not sure. For a long time, and Patrick, you mentioned it in your opening statements, there was the Arab Peace Initiative. Many analysts, Aaron was not the only one. I wrote this myself so many times, that the big lever, the big carrot was peace with not only with the Palestinians, but with additional 57 Arab and Muslim states in the region. If Israel, if there's establishment of an independent Palestinian state, then of course we find a just solution for the Palestinian refugees, and we know the conditions. But this is now removed, and this incentive is lacking. I'm really sad to say this, and I'm not insinuating anything, but, Aaron was a negotiator for a long time, and the fact is that Israel made concessions toward the Palestinians, not just toward the Palestinians, always in response to violence. And what I think, and I hope we can all get to, is sparing the violence, sparing the people's lives, and getting just to the step afterwards. I don't see it happening with the Trump peace to prosperity. I don't think it's much of a peace plan, but I don't see it's happening. A lot will depend on what's happening in the United States. Also, what happens in Israel politically, and that could change things. And of course, what happens on the Palestinians. We can talk about the UAE. What I would tell you that could be encouraging is that we know leadership does matter. If you look at public opinion polling before '93, the Israeli public really opposed negotiations with the PLO. And after Rabin went to, the Oslo process started, and Rabin went to meet with Arafat, there was 2/3 support on the part of the Israeli public, the Israeli Jewish public, for peace. So leadership does matter. The problem is that I don't have any good news for you, even though Netanyahu, it doesn't look like Netanyahu will hang on for many years, but who knows? We've been saying that for a long time. There also needs to be some leadership changes on the Palestinian front, and we can't just recommend changing leaders for incentivizing the Israelis to reach peace. Interestingly, I think on the peace agreements or normalization agreements with the UAE and Bahrain, maybe if it happened in a different time and it wasn't for the COVID crisis to spoil the party, some people would have been more excited. There was a little bit of excitement, a little bit of chatter, and pictures of Burj Khalifa and nice buildings. But frankly, no one remembers. It was not a big issue, not in the news, except for policy wonks. No one is even talking about it. For those of you who read about the situation in Israel, it's officially now, I think, the country is doing poorest on COVID. It's the only country in the world to enter a second lockdown. I just read that Netanyahu is threatening to close the whole country, full closure. You don't leave the house like Italy was, threatening to close the Ben Gurion airport. the idea is that he would also shut down the protests against him. There are 20,000 people in front of his house every Saturday, and also across the roads in the whole country. And Israel is still a democracy, so you can't shut demonstrations unless you enact a full closure. And this is what it seems like it's going. So people are concerned with their health. People are concerned with their livelihood. Unemployment is skyrocketing. There's a feeling of failure, and so people say, okay, Dubai, it's nice. Maybe if I ever can travel, if I can ever leave my house and I ever have enough money to travel somewhere, that could be a nice destination to visit. But really, this is not on the top of the mind of anyone in Israel. The big thing, however, I think for the people in my camp, and I think people here on this call, is that, we always said that there was an approach, there was a paradigm, right? You have to make some progress with the Palestinians to have all these really genuine back channel ties and connections that were between Israel and the different Gulf countries to bring them to light, so to speak. Because why would the Arabs do it? They were getting from Israel everything they wanted anyway. Behind the scenes, why did they need to make this public? We never thought about what they could get from the Trump administration, what they could get from the US. And it does feel like a bazaar sale, right? Sudan is asking to be removed from a terrorist list. They're asking for F-35s. The thing is, I think for people like us is how do we, when the dust settles, how do we turn this into an opportunity? How can we fix the peace process, which frankly was broken long before Trump came into office? And this is a challenge. Israel has not paid a big price for this deal, and I think it's irreversible unless Israel enacts annexation that really pokes a finger in the eyes of the Emiratis and does something very explicit that the Europeans would be upset. I don't think the de facto annexation with different legislation shticks that are already in the Knesset are going to do it. And there's also the issue of Jerusalem. Of course, if Israel builds a synagogue on the top of Temple Mount, that would be a problem. And there are crazy people pushing for it. I don't see Israel doing it in the near future, though.
Shira, I'm sorry to interrupt you at this point.
No, I'm done.
Yeah, you've raised, in fact, a really interesting question. The segue into Khalid's presentation on the Palestinians. They are the original stakeholders in this. Khalid.
Yes, thank you, Patrick, and greetings to all my panelists, my co-panelists. I'm the only Palestinian in the panel, and I'll try to be as fair as I can. I participated in dialogue on the Palestinian-Israeli peace as early as 1991 with Project Nishma of the American Jewish Congress. We had different breakfast discussions with Khalid Jahshan, other members of the Palestinian community here in Washington. I attended the signing of the peace agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis in 1991. I attended the signing of the Jordanians and Israelis, both in the White House. And I'm Palestinian from Haifa. My family was expelled in 1948 to Lebanon. I was born in Lebanon refugee camp. So even the peace agreement, the Oslo agreement, the peace agreement, the White House that was signed between Arafat and Rabin doesn't benefit me still or my family, since we're from the from the 48 part. Still, I was a strong supporter of the peace agreement because I thought that at one point people have to accept much less than what they were hoping for, and this continuous war should end. I have many problems, though, with this treaty, and many of these problems that this treaty really have nothing to do with the peace process or any peace process. First, the timing was done to help Trump get reelected. The show that was done on the White House, the signing of the agreement, the parties involved, UAE and Bahrain, probably some of the least Arab countries involved in the conflict, even though lots of the trolls on Twitter from many Gulf countries claim that we fought for so long and we sacrificed for the Palestinians. I believe some Arab countries did sacrifice. In the Gulf, probably mostly Kuwait, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon. but most the Saudis and the Emiratis really, and even Bahrain, didn't really sacrifice much. They probably spend more money on building palaces than they spend on the Palestinian conflict, or they spend on 1 year building palaces in Saudi Arabia and UAE than they'll spend on helping the Palestinians for the entire 30 or 40 years. So the justification does not really exist. And I agree with the speaker from Israel that, Afra, that there was no price Israel paid for this agreement. Everything was given on a gold platter. And I also think I question the way this whole thing was negotiated. This wasn't part of negotiating a peace agreement between the parties. This was more of a pressure from the Trump administration on Arab countries to show that they deliver some kind of peace agreement that helps the president get re-elected. It helps the president with the Jewish voters in the U.S. and funders, even though everyone knows that 70% of the Jewish votes goes for the Democrats. It's still, I think, Trump surrounded himself with people that allied themselves with the Israeli right, and they thought this will be a victory for Trump and for Netanyahu, and which also ended anyhow for the Palestinians that there will be any day of two-state solution. I believe the option of two-state solution is over. It does not exist anymore. And I believe that this agreement helped seal the fate of a two-state solution. The Israelis don't have to give up anything now. But the big question, what to do with the 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank and 2 million in Gaza? I think this is still a problem that Israel have to answer to. This peace treaty, or this treaty that's been told as a treaty that's a great victory, I don't think it answers any of these questions. The other problem, which I think the Israelis know very well, that they signed these treaties with two authoritarian governments, two governments that do not take their opinion in the street, and they don't care about it. Unlike the Israelis, they have to ratify the treaty. The Israeli Knesset have to vote on it and agree on it. The Arab rulers mostly make decisions on their own, and then they force it on their population, whether with a stick or with carrot. They have a bunch of their people surrounding them. They make them, or they force them to go and say nice or give nice statements and write articles in support of this, while in the street, the majority really don't support. The case of Bahrain is very clear. There have been demonstrations every day in Bahrain since this was signed. This wasn't only by the Shia, this was also by the Sunnis. It wasn't only Islamists. Many people on the left and what's left of Arab nationalists still oppose this agreement in Bahrain. In UAE, there's no way of knowing what the public believes, because UAE is a very, it's a much of a police state, and there isn't opinion that can be expressed critical of the government. So in the end, if you want peace treaty between governments without the support of the people, which I don't think you will get in any Arab country until the Palestinian question is answered, a peace treaty between Israel and Jordan and Egypt shows that not much normalization took place between the people of Egypt and the people of Jordan, the Israeli public, because still the big question hasn't been answered, what to do with the Palestinians. The Arab public in general, regardless of what you hear and see in the American press, the pro-Israel American press, that the Arabs don't care anymore about the Palestinians. I think there's an elite, represent 2 or 3 or maximum 10%, that support these treaties, and they say we are tired of the Palestinians and let's sign a treaty. But in general, the public have different opinion. I've traveled to all the Arab countries. I travel all the time, and I meet people from academia and media, and they frequently whisper in my ear because they're afraid that their government will hear what they say. But the streets still have their heart and mind with the Palestinians. Unless that problem is solved, I think you will just have another problem in the future. You probably will have a treaty now, you crush the people for months and years, then something will happen, and all these accomplishments will be reversed.
Khalid, thank you so much. All of you have raised an issue, raised the issue of the people in the participating countries, so to speak. The people, how do the people in Israel see it? They haven't noticed. How do the and how do the Gulf people see it? We've got mixed emotions, but it doesn't seem to be at the top of their agenda either. But a real question to me, and this is in particular questions for Khalid and for Aaron, how does this play out in American politics? There used to be a truism, which I still think is true, is that no U.S. election has ever been remotely decided by a foreign policy issue. Is the same true for this? Did President Trump and Jared Kushner shoot their wad on this one, trying to get a foreign policy victory of some sort? And if we have even if the Trump administration stays in power, or if there is a Biden administration, where's the U.S. going to go on this? Is it going to build on it, or is this a one-off event? Aaron, Khalid, whoever wants to go first.
I would argue that the United States right now is suffering a quadrifecta of crises. There's a pandemic which is still raging and will be for some time to come, vaccine or no vaccine. There's an economic recession, the consequences of which are still unclear, structural changes in the economy, tremendous uncertainty. That's the second crisis. The third is increasing polarization along racial, class, and political lines. And finally, you have a crisis of confidence in America's institutions, from the post office to the census to the CDC. I would argue to you that the bandwidth for any administration to seriously engage on an issue which, frankly, in my judgment, is just one of the many sources of dysfunction and instability in this broken and dysfunctional Middle East, the bandwidth is going to be very limited, extremely limited. And I still would argue to you that for this transaction, and that's what I think it is still a transaction, these two sets of arrangements. For the transaction to evolve into a transformation, you need to see other things start to happen. You need to see more Arab states join. You have to see, I think, the ultimate prize, Saudi Arabia, at some point. MBS will chair, or Salman will chair the G20 in Riyadh in November. Some have speculated that may be too soon. There's the issue of whether it'll happen at all while Salman lives. But you'd have to see more traction. You'd have to see a modicum, I think Shira referred to it, you'd have to see a modicum of reasonable behavior on the part of the Israelis. Not qualitatively and quantitatively doing things that would cause MBZ, and he would turn on a dime, I suspect, in response to things that demonstrated that the commitment on annexation had somehow been reversed. So as potentially significant as this is, it's hard for me to see, how it figures in an election. I mean, someone pointed out the other day that Ron DeSantis won his race by about 40,000 votes in Florida. So could you argue theoretically that in states with heavily concentrated Jewish populations, this accomplishment on paper might sway some? I haven't met a human being yet, however, that would change his or her vote either pro or anti-Trump based on this. So no, I think I think that this is a distracted American public and a distracted Israeli public, frankly.
Any comments?
I agree. I think it will not make a dent. I think Trump maybe thought 2 nominations for the Nobel Peace Prize could help him with independence. I think he thought appearing on the signing of the peace agreement in the White House that he looks like a world leader, which he has failed. The U.S. Positive and public opinion worldwide is way down because of Trump, but he would like to believe that he's popular. He would like to do some major accomplishments. I don't think world leaders think this is an accomplishment. I don't think the Europeans thought this was a big accomplishment. I don't think the Arab street and even rulers thought it was an accomplishment. And to be fair, I think UAE has other interests beside the peace process. I think the leadership in UAE is very ambitious. They have hopes of having expanding their power. They're playing a major role as a superpower, much bigger than their size in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, and other parts of the Arab world, even in Tunisia and Morocco. And they believe building alliance with the Israelis and the Americans. And like David Miller said, being on the good side of the Israelis helped them a lot with the Americans, and I think this was the main goal. Bahrain in the beginning said no, and I think they said no for internal reasons, and probably because they didn't get the nod from the Saudis. And later on, pressure from this administration, from Jared Kushner mainly, they caved in. But you have to follow of how this agreement or these treaties came to light. If any of you is following the talks with Sudan, you can see 2 days ago on BBC, I debated a gentleman from Sudan and another gentleman from Dubai. Clearly, the guy from Sudan, who's very close to the ruling power now, said that they were offered 1.2 billion in aid by the US and probably by UAE, and another 20 million worth of grains because they have real needs for help. And they thought the amount wasn't enough. So it's this is bribery. The US is trying to bribe these countries into signing these agreements. UAE didn't need the money, but they needed the protection. They needed the political and military support, which they got now. The F-35, Bahrain is a very small country with a large Shia minority, very close to Iran, been threatened by Iran since 1971, since its existence. Iran considered Bahrain as part of Iran, and even during the Shah, that was the same situation. So they're in a very difficult position. And they signed the agreement have nothing to do with they care about the Israelis or the Palestinians as much as just selfish reasons in Bahrain. But we cannot dismiss everything America asked him to do. Pompeo 2 weeks ago asked the Sudanese to normalize with Israel to help them get off the terrorism list and to get off the US veto for loans from the World Bank and the IMF. And the Sudanese clearly said in public, please separate these issues. But this is just an example of how this peace treaty came to light.
You mentioned, Khalid, a great number of subjects. One that has not come up at all, though you did passing to it, again, is there are only 2 powerful Muslim countries in the region at the moment. All of the Arab states, Egypt possibly excluded, are either in disarray or in the middle of a civil war or falling apart or barely recovering, like Iraq, from a civil war. So the only 2 prominent Muslim countries in the region, both of whom have Islamist governments to some degree or other, and both of whom have come out against this, seemingly to put themselves at the forefront of a new Muslim alliance against Israel, which are Turkey and Iran. Israel is already looking at the possibility of a confrontation with Turkey over over maritime rights in Mediterranean. Iran and Israel have been trading blows and killing Syrians in between them. Do they play a role? Can they affect things, do you think, in the future negatively? Or how will the role of Turkey and Iran play out? That is open to anyone right now.
Yeah, I just came back from Turkey. I was in Turkey for a couple of weeks. I came back on Sunday. During my visit, I met with a university professor from Ankara who is very close with the AKP party, and he told me that Erdogan's plan 6 years ago, was to build a Sunni alliance with Saudi Arabia. And he told me that he invited King Salman right after he came to power, and he was Erdogan never treated any foreign dignitary like he treated Salman. They drafted all kinds of projects and plans to counter Iran. The original plan was to counter Iran in the region by building a Sunni alliance. Things turned differently. I think they had disagreements mostly because of Mohammed bin Salman. But if you notice, after the assassination or killing of Jamal Khashoggi, Erdogan avoided attacking King Salman. He constantly criticized Mohammed bin Salman, but never said anything directly against him. And the Turkish media, the pro-government media, was reserved on attacking King Salman. He was hoping that at one point he will get rid of his son and come back. But now Turkey feels squeezed between their bad relationship with Europe. They have problems with Greece. They have a problem with the maritime issues where the European Union sided with Greece. They have a problem with Cyprus. And then they have another major problem with Egypt, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. That's intensified in Libya. There's behind the scene also battles in Syria where UAE and Saudi Arabia are helping the Kurds to keep Turkey busy over there. And that pushed Turkey closer to coordinate with Iran and with the Russians, which I think part of this problem is the responsibility of the US in the absence of America from the scene. That's pushing, you might end up with Turkey having an alliance with China, Russia, Iran, because they don't believe that the US is standing with them, and the Europeans, according to this gentleman, are conspiring against them. So I think we might see shifting alliances between Turkey and other parties in the next couple of years, especially if the US, and I believe if Trump loses the elections, the US relationship with Turkey will get much worse because Biden said it clearly, I think in December of last year, 2019 interview with the New York Times, he was very critical of Turkey and of Erdogan.
Shira, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly on Turkey, because it's such a big issue. It's not just Biden, it's also the bureaucracy. You know, the RAND Corporation, we did a big study for the U.S. Army on Turkey. As you all know, there are nuclear weapons in Turkey. It's a NATO ally, so it's a big issue for the U.S. And the assessment is not political so much. There's an assessment that Turkey has taken a different turn, and that this type of the relationship, the alliance is not going this way. But arguably, you know, when we talk about the region, if you look at the UAE motivation, one of it is also to stand to Erdogan. This is a big thing, and where this manifests, I think, in the context of the Palestinian issues. You know, when you talk about Hamas, there are going to be elections, internal elections in Hamas. Turkey and Qatar, they support Yahya Sinwar. Iran, you know, is backing Saleh Haruri. There are different players in there, and also Turkey, the role that it plays in Jerusalem, that really concerns Israel. We do have to say, though, that even though the political ties between Israel and Turkey are very poor, and there's a dispute on the Eastern Mediterranean gas. Not just with Israel, by the way, with Cyprus and Greece, it's like high school politics here, right? What happened between Israel and Turkey, and then shifting to Greece. But there's still a vibrant trade between Israel and Turkey. The commercial ties are still good. So this, I think, is important, that there's still tourism. So I think one-sided tourism, but there's still tourism. So I think that is important. I just want to say a few things because I think it is important to jump to what Khalid said. One thing was about the publics in those countries that do not support the normalization agreements. And of course, this is correct. Look at Egypt and Jordan. Those are ties that don't have normalized ties with Israel. They have peace treaties with Israel after a war. You can't call these ties normal. You can't celebrate Jewish holidays in Jewish is okay if you're from, but you can't be Israelis. The strongest anti-normalization movements are in Jordan and in Egypt. So to expect that publics would support it is I think, a bit delusional. On the other hand, when you look at the citizens, the population of Bahrain and UAE combined, I think those are combined less than the population of Gaza. So are they really important, what the public thinks? This is, this is an issue. Also, in terms of the U.S., I don't think, I agree completely with Aaron. I think that if anything, what the evangelical, those who support Israel, care about Israel, they care about Jerusalem. They don't care about, Israelis traveling to Dubai. So this is not an issue. And it does feel that the Trump administration pushed for it, but really I think the biggest, the smartest players were the Emiratis here. Because so far, it doesn't look like they're paying a cost for this move, right? There was a risk that they took on their part. I don't see that they're paying too big of a price. They can market this as offering the face-saving ladder to climb down from the annexation tree, which I'm not sure anyone wanted, but this is like they did this service. And they're getting all the goodies, F-35s and who knows what. So I think others are joining in, and Khalid described it. It's like a bazaar. It's a wholesale party. Let's get whatever we can from the Trump administration before it might go away. The big question is, of course, Saudi and Israelis are waiting for it, and there's there are a lot of questions about whether it's going to be Mohamed bin Salman when his father passes away. There is also the same element as described on Turkey. Biden himself called Saudi a pariah state, and the question is if Saudi, if there's a transition in Washington, if Saudi can see peace with Israel as a way to pave its way back to Congress. And this is a question that I don't have the answer for, but I could see this as an incentive. Otherwise, I don't see why take the risk.
On that same line, along the lines of the outside players, Mohamed, I'd like to ask you a question. Do the people of the Gulf look at this as something that makes them feel a little bit safer with Iran, a little bit less safe with Iran, or does it make any difference?
I think it's, generally speaking, it's safer with Iran now after this peace treaty. I did mention when I start talking that the UAE and Bahrain have both an insurance policy. If Trump come again, he will remember that they came to rescue him, inverted commas, during his knees. And if Biden came, he couldn't, in fact, go again to Obama policy vis-a-vis Iran. He has to think because of the Israeli UAE and Bahrain, and of course other Arabs' relation with the United States. Going to some points raised by Khalid, if I may. I mean, it's unfortunate that we overlook the help given by the Gulf, by the Saudis, by the Kuwaitis, by others to the Palestinians. It's a lot. And cynically speaking, if we have been talking for a long time that the Palestinians with two heads is very difficult to gain any sort of ground vis-a-vis the Israelis, and now they are talking together to make probably peace between them. I mean, Hamas and Ramallah. If this has happened, So this is a very good goal of this treaty. I mean, if we pushed the Palestinian to unite, this is very good. Unfortunately, they are doing it in Istanbul. Turk has, as was mentioned, have a very good relation with Israel. The Palestinian would like us to solve a very difficult combination. Your enemy is my enemy is your enemy, and your enemy is my friend. I mean, this is something you couldn't go with it. Hamas has a very good relation with the Iranian, and in those lines, just a couple of weeks ago, we talked to Hania. Some other Arabs want to go to push the Palestinians together, and he said, well, they are giving us money and they are giving us arms. I mean, what kind of arms they are giving him? And the portion of money he's getting from the Arabs is much more than what he's getting from the Iranian. So to conclude, I don't think the Palestinian, unfortunately, is looking to the issue in a positive way. They can use this pushing their cause a little bit further. Unfortunately, they just forget that the Egyptians, the Jordanian, and themselves. We remember that Mr. Yasser Arafat, when he was talking to Mr. Rabin in, I think, 1993 or 96, he said, well, we are cousins. I mean, we are all Ibrahims. Even Rabin was joking at that time. He said that we Israelis have a problem that we are talking, but now it looks you are an Israeli as well, or a Jewish as well. I don't remember the word. So to conclude, I do think that we have to look carefully to what's going on, and we have to look carefully to the threat of the Iranian. The Iranian is already there in Iraq. They are already there in Syria. They are already there in Lebanon. They are already there in Yemen. Look what's going in Yemen. Look what's going in Lebanon. I mean, there is no government. There is even in a few months' time there will be no food. So unfortunately, they are playing havoc in the Middle East on the notion of idea that they will bring the Farsi empire again, and this is lunatic to me.
Thank you.
Patrick, can I?
Yes, sure.
Just for a second. I mean, I think I wrote about this in Politico several weeks ago. I think we all have to come to a certain sort of sober realization, watching the headlines and the trend lines, that in terms of American national interests, separating what's vital from what's discretionary, Middle East is no longer the core area of U.S. concern. The three core interests that the United States has in this region: number one, preventing an attack on the continental United States; number two, ensuring, not for our purposes, but for the purposes of global health and well-being, the free flow of oil; and number three, a stake in countering the emergence of a regional hegemon with a nuclear weapon. Okay? Those are the three things that American presidents over the past 50, 60 years have been willing to sacrifice: American lives, American treasure, and American credibility. I think that one of the reasons the Emiratis are aligning themselves to a certain degree with the Israelis is that they understand what's happening. They understand that the American commitment to this region is declining. I mean, think about it. We spent $60 billion in the wake of 9/11, not to mention what we expended in two of the most profitless wars in American history. No person of good conscience can justify the commitment that the U.S. made and the suffering that it inflicted based on the returns. And yet, The real issue of American well-being and security and prosperity came not in a jihadi terror attack. It came in the form of a pandemic, which may ultimately, if the Washington University models are right, will kill 400,000 Americans by January. That's bumping up against the 675,000 that died in the 1917-1980 Great Influenza. We need a new definition of homeland security. It's climate. It's pandemic. It's not worrying about what's happening in Lebanon and Syria and the tick and the tock of Iraq. I profoundly believe, last point, I don't care who wins on this point. If it's Biden, he's going to face the greatest task of national recovery of any American president since Franklin Roosevelt, without the benefit of a world war that left Americans stronger at home and with more influence abroad. We are fundamentally weakened here, both at home and abroad, as a consequence, not just of the last 4 years, but of the last 20 plus years. And part of it is because of our incessant focus on a region that simply doesn't carry the sort of strategic significance for this country that it used to. And we got to get over that so we don't continue to make the kinds of mistakes, that costly mistakes that we've made. The Israelis will take care of themselves, okay? They're quite capable. They have agency. We will continue to support them. We'll do what we need to with our Gulf state partners, despite the fact that we share almost no common values with them. And we'll pick and choose. But I think a reorientation is coming on this whole question of American interests and American influence. Sorry to drone on, but as an American, this is a very important point to me.
Aaron, I've got to tell you that I think the same thing keeps me up at night that keeps you up at night. This then leads back to the internal politics of the Gulf and of the region. I wrote a paper not too long ago suggesting that one of the reasons the UAE took this initiative is because the UAE, precisely as you said, looks forward to a situation where the United States is not going to be the ultimate protector. And the other country that the UAE has competed with, fears, has felt threatened with in the past is Saudi Arabia. So my contention at the time was that the UAE very much may be trying to build a relationship with Israel with Saudi Arabia as the threat in mind, even more than Iran as the threat in mind. And which then leads to a question. Everything in the last 10 years or 20 years in the Middle East seems to have been centered around religion. There's been no religious discussion on anything today. It's not a question of religion, unless some nutcase on one side or the other does something. But my question is, the legitimacy of Saudi Arabia was built on religion. Will religion in any way, in your view, dominate what the Saudis do next for anybody? That seems like a unanimous opinion that it won't.
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
I think without going to the recent history, generally speaking, in the Gulf, we have supported the American in Afghanistan, and we sent young men there under the banner of, Islamization. It was unfortunate. What happened at that time, before 30 years ago, that we thought to compact the Islamic Republic of Iran to use the same agenda, Islamization. So we have pushed for Sunni Islam, if you like. But at the end of the day, we ended with Bin Laden and Daesh and other people. What Mohammed bin Salman is doing, that he's changing the course now. Opening, women freedom, economic development, and I hope sometime we will have some sort of political development in Saudi Arabia as well, so we can have, quote unquote, the same values with the American and the West in general. And I do think that we have now alternative agenda. We have changed course. Unfortunately, there are still people very fundamentalist in Iran, and Erdogan, as you can see, moving right and center with no clear, to my mind, political agenda with the Muslim brothers and some other smaller Gulf states. So what we have here, which was I am writing about constantly, that we should have our own, if you like, a modern national state, a democratic state as well. We have it in one way or another in Kuwait, because the freedom of speech, as you know, in Kuwait is a little bit open. But I think this is what the Gulf should adopt in the coming few years. Otherwise, we will be on the same boat. To go back to the Palestinian, unless they get together in one body, there will be a problem. What they are doing now in Istanbul is Lebanizing, if you like, Lebanizing the Palestinian cause.
I mean, a practical worst. I mean,
Right. And we're, 2/3 of the newly discovered pathogens in the world are viruses. And if you haven't read it, there's a fascinating article in Cell magazine by Tony Fauci and a colleague on the acceleration of disease as humans and animals encroach upon one another's territory. I mean, the ultimate worst, would be pandemic. That makes COVID-19 look pale by comparison. A sort of great influenza that killed anywhere from 50 to 100 million people. And we're no better equipped to deal with, certainly many regions of the world, the Middle East is among them, under-resourced, underfunded, under-institutionalized. I think in terms of national security, Patrick, these days, not in terms of the prospects of a North Korean nuclear launch against CONUS or an American-Russian nuclear war. I think that's old think. I'm watching what's happening in California. Read the New York Times Magazine this week. As they seek to find livable areas in the United States and in the world. Ben-Veniste he was a teacher and a scholar, and he had tremendous interest in the Palestinian issue. And Meron argued even 20, 30 ago that the Shepherd's War, a nasty internal conflict in which two peoples, as Ben Franklin said, proximity breeds contempt and children. Two peoples whose lives are so inextricably linked together that they're going to continue to quarrel violently for a very long time to come. I would only close by saying, I think as normalization, if it goes forward between Israel and the Arab states, the reality that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with the exception of Jordan, will become a localized enterprise with very little regional reach and influence, holds out real possibility. And frankly, the less interest there is in this conflict, one might argue maybe the parties will get together. I don't believe that for a minute. Sorry to drone on.
I'm glad my paranoia is rubbing off on you, Aaron. Mohamed.
Patrick, Jews worry for a living. So, I worry for a living, basically.
Right. Mohamed, the worst thing that could happen, most likely thing that will happen is in the next year.
I believe most likely things to happen that the Iranian took a preemptive strike on the some of the Gulf facilities, and this is a nightmare to us and probably the world. Having said that, we have to look 8-9 months from here for the election, the president election in Iran, and probably somebody more fundamentalist will get over after Rouhani. So I don't think that some sort of rapprochement will happen between Iran and the international world, U.S. and the Gulf. The second thing, I think we have to push for a great idea I'm believing in, that the Israelis is here to stay and the Palestinian is here to stay. So it's better to go to a peace path rather than conflict. Unfortunately, both sides have this kind of sentimental, ideas. We have to fight as quote unquote intellectual, if you like, to that. Starting by changing our school teaching in both sides, and Israelis vis-a-vis the Arabs, and within the Arabs vis-a-vis the Jewish and the Israelis.
Thank you very much, Mohamed. Shira, I think that is a great entry for your final comment.
Well, I don't know what's going to be the worst and the best. Before that, I just want to, because there was a question of Saudi Arabia, and I think it's interesting, their religion. I think the other incentives that play here, and this goes into what the United Arab Emirates, now that the sale of the F-35 is being green-lighted, it's very likely that it would turn into a precondition for any future agreement with Saudi Arabia, and there are other goodies in store. So I think that's something to think about also. In terms of, I'm just going to, also on Iran, I think we talk about Iran, and there's a lot of also marketing in Israel is like, oh, they want our Israeli technology, and also we are 100% aligned on Iran. It's not true. The Emirates have been, geography does play a part here, and their COVID aid flights from UAE to Tehran, there were a few. So I think they're hedging. They're not with Iran where Iran is. I'll try to limit what we were talking about, just the Israeli-Palestinian front, because I think that's, sort of where I am now. The worst that can happen, of course, is a third intifada or a Palestinian Authority collapse. And Khalid is here on the line. He can tell me, but what I'm reading, we might not be that far from it. The Palestinian Authority has refused to accept the tax revenue money that Israel collects on its behalf under the Oslo Agreement. The reason was annexation, but now annexation threat has been removed and they're still accepting those payments. The fact that it means that they're not paying salaries. We already have defectors, Palestinian security force officials, that are personnel that are going to work in Israel instead. So this is very risky. What's likely going to happen is, this continuation of the status quo, which is really terrible, I think, for the Palestinians, and eventually would also hurt the Israelis, even though they don't think about it. There is a way out, hopefully, if the two sides can can think creatively of how to use these agreements to start a peace process that is real, not just bringing the Palestinians and Israelis into the room for the sake of a process, which I'm honestly, I'm very afraid that the Biden administration might want to do, because that's what they've been doing. But it's failed before, and there's no reason it would succeed. So have a real process, bringing spoilers in. There was a little bit of debate in the U.S. after Peter Beinart, or the two-state solution is collapsing. It must be a one-state. I think it's nonsense. There are two national movements, and the national sentiment is very strong, both on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. They're not designed to live together now. So this is something, and the last thing, I hate being this Israeli that criticizes the Palestinians, but I think for us, the Israelis that really want peace and work to achieve peace, it would be really helpful to see constructive actions on the part of the Palestinians now, to enable us not to sound like we are delusional ourselves, that, there is maybe light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you.
Khalid, that puts you in the most comfortable and the least comfortable position as the last speaker in wrapping it all that up.
Yeah.
Where do the Palestinians go? What should they do? What can they do?
Well, the problem first, the Palestinians need a new leadership. I don't think any of the Palestinians on both sides, Gaza or West Bank, represent most Palestinians. I think the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah is corrupt. It's not very popular. And they also been providing security for the Israelis. They've been crushing any protests, even to protest corruption in this authority, in the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. So this is a problem, but that doesn't make the Israeli leadership much better. I think this is a coalition of extremist parties. I mean, you have corruption, you have bad leadership on the Palestinian side, but on the Israeli side, you also have the least pro-peace coalition in Israel's history. These are right-wing parties that build their reputation on opposing the peace process when Rabin was trying to have peace with the Palestinians. So I don't think the situation looks very good. I agree.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but I agree.
Yeah. So things doesn't look very good. And I think there is a likelihood of a third intifada, probably maximum by the summer of next year. I have many friends that live in the West Bank who are very unhappy with the authority, of the Palestinian Authority, and they sense the situation. Between COVID and money been cut by the Israeli government, you have to remember that 100,000 Palestinian families live on money that comes from the Palestinian Authority. The bulk of that money comes from the European Union. The US cut all funding. Arab countries, with the exception of maybe Qatar and Kuwait, stopped money to the Palestinian Authority. The Qatar has been funding basically the situation in Gaza. Beside that, most of the money been cut off of this authority. And so I think the economic situation is very bad. Unemployment is 40%, at least 40% in the West Bank, and I don't see any scenario where an intifada doesn't erupt by the summer of next year, if not even earlier.
Well, thank you all. I think on that note, I can make one summation. No one here really thinks that a lot of good is going to come out of what just happened. That at best it may not be important. At worst, it could get worse. Thank you all very much. It's been a great pleasure to have you here. I would ask our audience to clap, but you wouldn't be able to hear them, but I'm sure they all are. Thank you again. It's a pleasure, and we hope to see you at our next event at the Gulf International Forum.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.